Okay, so here we are in a soon-to-be non-restaurant in Bethnal Green.
Absolutely.
Like so many things, soon not to be. With a
like
theme.
you and I.
Yes, exactly.
Soon not to be.
Soon not to be. I'm here with Kevin Rhowbotham, I'm Paul Davies, and Kevin has an extremely illustrious career, of course. We won't dwell too much in introductions, but we decided to get together to make a podcast on various themes, ideas in architecture, if you like. And we decided our first one might be rationalism, because of course there seems to be so little of it, and maybe that's what might fascinate us, or not.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I guess we all try to be rational when we're making a design. I was trying to be rational the other day with my plans. I'm sure Kevin tries to be rational. But we're looking here for the idea, right?
We
so
are.
What is the idea of rationalism?
Well, I think the first thing we should do is to talk about, what rationalism actually means. So the philosophical definition of rationalism is that which is produced by intellectual reflection. It's got nothing to do with science, which is to do with measuring things.
Right.
And science, of course, uses rationalism, but there is a traditional problem of empirical measurement and rational thinking, because, of course, rational thinking is not determined. It can't be, in the end, externally verified by observation. Rationalism is the pursuit of knowledge intellectually, without recourse to physical events. The problem with science is, of course, that it always relies on something which might interpret the data that it records. Science can't exist without some mental ability or some human agent to actually animate the things that it...
Animate science, if you like.
Quite so, which
Right.
leads some people to argue that only in rationalism, only in mental activity, can you certainly acquire understanding of the world.
So, given our subject is this tawdry business of architecture, and everything is an approximation when it finds itself into architecture, how has it been done? Who manifests rationalism more than other characters? We could go through a whole list of populism, organicism, endless numbers of stuff.
Well, to that extent, all architects exhibit a certain kind of rational engagement. But what we want to talk about isn't really that architects have intellectual life, although this is highly questionable, as you've questioned on a number of occasions, and I'm right behind you. Do architects actually think, or are they actually part and parcel of the material objects that they try to fashion?
Or part of just the economy.
Part of the economy, quite.
Just agents of the economic system.
Another aspect of empirical measurement, in my view, which is exposed to rationalism as a second-order affect. But without going too much into that, what we want to know is what did architects mean when they called themselves rationalists? And this is very interesting. And there are some, of course, serious contenders for members of this club. One of which would be Behrens, and another would be Berlage. Berlage,
really?
Particularly, well, Berlage
Sort of structural rationalism in Berlage, wasn't
precisely.
it?
He wanted to exclude all kinds of extraneous
Bits and bobs.
bits and bobs. Yes,
And there's a post office, or is it? There's a banking hall, isn't there, by Berlage?
There is a
It's
very
terrific.
large building by Berlage in the city of London, which is a brick
Peter
building.
Palumbo's favourite.
It is a stunning building. But the point about Berlage is that he attempts to exclude all decoration and leave the organisation of form and volume to the distribution of structure and plane. And this is a serious intellectual engagement.
For sure. So we end up with, structural grids and the expression of material, I guess, and fitness for purpose. In functionalism, I often associate, extreme forms of rationalism with very, very tough forms of functionalism.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happened? Those grids, they all got a bit Whoopsie, I suppose.
Well, I guess what happened was Mies.
Right.
And the interesting thing is, as you know very well, much better than I do actually, that Mies emerges from an expressionist background, which is very strange. So we have via a neoplastic discipline of Die Style, because his country house for the country, is probably the first that I know anyway, although maybe this is not true because of the Vesnova group and the whole suprematist tendency in Russia, which was gripped by graphical painting, and particularly the work of Malevich, which we'll come back to because Malevich was a big influence on all this.
Yeah.
For Mies, that there was some kind of prescient spatiality in the two-dimensional work of the neoplastic group. His interest was, of course, in the extension of space by...
There's always a reference made to a Van Doesburg painting.
Well, Van Doesburg
but Mies himself was hesitant. At least Frank Schultz says that he was hesitant to be too much aligned. There is that story about when he did the last skyscrapers in Berlin, that he was trying to literally enjoy the twinkle of the sunlight on the glass, which sounds very kind of precise and very unstructural. Those curved facets, and enjoying the curved facets of the, hanging his head out the window and looking at it and going, "Oh, I think this looks good." That doesn't sound very disciplined to me, but
Well, the plan. I presume you're asking that question tongue in cheek, because
yes.
you know damn well that the Lakeshore Drive apartments, which you know very well.
Yeah. Okay, so the point being that there is a beauty in Mies, which is something, an astonishing visual effect. Let's put it that way. Which doesn't, although. There's more than just a structural means. There's more than just the expression of structure. And it's very hard to quantify.
Well, I mean, in Mies, there's an adoption of the whole neoclassical canon reduced to the terms which are sympathetic to contemporary commercial building.
Yeah.
So, I mean, something you see reflected in the American...
Any of them.
Yeah.
I mean, the Seagram building is a bunch of fairly crooked, distillers dressing up
completely crooked distillers, and a guy who is put on the selection committee of the...
We will just carry on with it. But it is funny, of course. Mies was rescued from Germany by Philip Johnson.
So he says.
So Philip Johnson probably said. And he has a mysterious past too, but of course it was appropriate that Mies got himself out of Berlin with nothing but a Max Beckmann painting under his arm. And of course fitted the bill for the modernism of the 50s, the sort of,
Interesting he took a Beckmann, because Beckmann is a rationalist.
There are stories of him going to strip clubs in Chicago. It's another rationalist in that vein, of course, was Mies's associate Ludwig Hilverseimer.
Ludwig Hilverseimer, yes, quite so. A great man, much maligned.
Exactly.
And much misunderstood, because he's only remembered for a series of, draconian exercises in reduction, when actually his oeuvre was huge, and particularly in terms of the later work, he was interested in, what was happening to the American city, and documented that quite comprehensively.
And Lafayette Park. It's Detroit, isn't it? I mean, it's 1960s. It looks perfectly fine to me. I've got one book on it. It looks brilliant, in fact.
Yeah.
But Ludwig Hilverseimer was the character in the 1970s who all the critics turned on as the representative of uber-functionalism.
Yeah.
And this seems to me to be a bit, no matter what he might have been like. Apparently he was a very nice fellow, and Mies was less nice, but as an associate, Hilverseimer was more easy to get on with. But he really got it in the neck, Hilverseimer's drawings, throughout the late 70s and 80s, as the reference point for modernism being a disaster.
Well, quite. I mean, I'm sure that modernism had approached that point of, critical non-return, really, because of short-term disasters caused by building too high. Building too high was a big problem, because if you build social housing too high, you've got to meet the excessive costs for maintaining buildings over 6 stories. We all know that building over 6 stories is much more expensive, maintaining is much more expensive. Money's moving out of the exchequer.
And the money wasn't in the bank.
Exactly.
That's exactly what happened at Pruitt-Igoe, where I just had a student write an essay about the failure of Pruitt-Igoe, which was the canonical moment when everybody said, "Oh, modernism's over." Well, apparently it's because they didn't have the maintenance plan in place, and therefore it just didn't happen. And so you can rewrite the whole history of modernism if you look at the government contracts to support those buildings.
But we ought to pin down this idea of rationalism a bit further, because it can be struck against the very German idea of Neue Sächlichkeit, or new realism, or whatever it's called, new
spirit,
objectivity.
New objectivity, that's it.
So this new objectivity, which you see as a kind of what Malevich called in his World as Object, or might have referred to, I shouldn't say called it, might have referred to the additional element, is the thing that adds to the mix. You bring along a concept like new objectivity, which is a frightening concept in the aesthetics of the bourgeoisie and the middle class. And of course it rebakes the cake in a very different form. Rationalism wasn't the new objectivity, in my view. It became the new objectivity, because rationalism at first was a return to a quality of mental and intellectual reflection on the nature of the possibilities of architecture.
Which we've lost, because actually we're just now agents of the market.
Well, profoundly agents of the market. I mean, so much so that I think that the false consciousness is complete. These days, you can't speak to an architect educated, before 1989 in any terms that seem to me to be intelligent at all.
So why we can wallow around and talk about the distinctions of the scholarship of Mies and all the rest of it? Actually, the contemporary figure, I suppose, might think, isn't parametricism rational? What would you say to that?
Well, parametricism.
He laughs.
Parametricism.
It can't be in my book, but
rational. Well, it uses rational means, but we don't really mean that. Does it give us knowledge about the world by using rational means? And parametricism is a means by which parameters of different aspects of the object can be altered in a coordinated way with other parameters. What's been made of parametricism seems to me to be a desperate solipsism, looking for something to paint the hideous walls of architecture with, and something which then becomes claimable as the next commodity which marks out a tendency in architecture. It's nothing of the kind.
It's no surprise then that those stalwarts believing in parametricism as a sort of last gasp tend to like to say that that's got nothing to do with people, politics, sociality, or anything. Like Patrick Schumacher.
Why bother doing it then?
Yeah, so why bother doing it? I mean, it's completely laughable. I mean, can you try talking about the Gothic revival without talking about culture, politics, sociology?
So what you're saying is that this is a style of total self-indulgence, which is exactly what I feel it is. It is solipsistic.
Exactly.
It believes in a world that is entirely conjured up by the individual. That I'm the only person that exists, and everybody else is a figment of what I think.
Which is your perspective on rationalism is this intellectual engagement, which the last place you found traction with it was in the schools back in the 90s, maybe late 80s, 90s.
No, it isn't. And this is another thing I think that beyond Neue Sächlichkeit, I think its closest touch point with things that might be going on now is conceptualism,
right.
And it is certainly the rigorous nature of conceptual art to pursue its object that remains close to a potential rationalism, and that associates itself with Ungers, because Ungers wanted an architecture of concept. We could sketch out what a rational concept might be. It might be, for example, that there's too much building in the world, and we should not put one brick upon another because we've already got too much building. I mean, when I roughly check the internet, something like 25% of all building mass is not occupied, 25% is unoccupiable, and 25% is vacant, which means 25% is occupied.
Exactly, but unfortunately, if you interview the director of legal in general, he will say the problem with the city is not overdevelopment, it's under redevelopment. Because he is looking for to deal with it to get returns from his money. That is the fundamental crisis. Well, it's nothing to do with people. It's to do with so-called liquidity, and that's a fraud. I mean, it's just idiotic.
Well, that's an ideology. Yeah. But I would like to ask of that ideology this question: what is the project?
Oof. God, that's tough. So can we go back to a concrete
what is
example?
The rational project?
Let's go to something that you know very well because you work there. So if we went to Ungers' own house, the one with the round bit, and it looks really peculiar on the edge of end of a terrace, which is a building you particularly love.
I do.
And if you read the text about it in the standard Ungers volumes, they wax lyrical about this building. But it's hard to understand precisely why. So let's find out. What do you think, Kev? What is it about that house which is so brilliant? Is it that it's a mirror of the city as a house, or because it's got a street down the middle of it, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and
he extended it as well with a huge library.
He did, well, yeah, but after I worked there, that was later, and the library is much more unforgiving as an architectural idea than the house, and the house was. Built in the 50s, and so with the other houses he did in Berlin, which were fairly commodious, well worked out social housing projects, which were, I suppose, picked up in the UK by James Sterling and particularly James Gowan, who were interested in that rational tendency. They were very good buildings, but they were with exposed floor slabs and cantilever beams. The brutalist language, quite. They were brutalist, although softened by the kind of raked mortar brickwork that they used at the time.
And tiles.
And what?
And tiles. He had a sloping roof.
And tiles. And a sloping roof in parts.
Gowan did some terrific stuff. The house in the Isle of Wight I was looking at, and that guy could really do a wood burner.
Well, they did a lot of wood burners.
Really could make a house around a wood burner. But the Ungers' own house, and I've looked at the plans for that continually, and it is, everybody loves it. But the thing is, maybe I just hadn't. I'd like to go and see it. I'd like to find out what it was. Certainly, when he extended it, it did look more of a city as a house than.
Well, the thing is, he's interested in Alberti, I mean, it's all. He was influential sources of Weinbrenner, who of course taught Schinkel, and there's a whole line of association in German rationalism or early neoclassical tendency in the 17th century, 18th century, which comes down to Ungers through these architects, which he wanted to hold on to. I mean. He was very much influenced by Rossi's 1966 book, The City, and the idea of a city that might be healed by a series of projected fragments, which understood the city as a series of external spaces to be
hold on, that doesn't sound very rational at all. That sounds really emotional.
Well, quite. This is why we need to understand what rationalism actually means. And don't forget, rationalism at first, certainly in the architectural sphere, subtended classical solutions. And that is why I think that people like Porphyrios, probably a rather, not a very good example, but Rossi ended their careers in neoclassical work. Ungers was seriously moving there. Precisely why I don't know, because I'd been brought back into the UK and was under the influence of the re-emergence of a kind of postmodern modernism, which has become a kind of parody of itself, not taking on the rational precepts of why modernism existed at all, which was to produce a kind of architecture for to be occupied by a greater section of society, for in a way.
Well, it was the first time that we'd actually considered the house as a reasonable meat, the ordinary house, as a medium for architecture. We'd taken us 2,500 years to get that. And then what did we do? We junked it in favour of supermarkets. It was really rather a disaster.
Well, yeah. I mean, the ordinary house, the house for people who didn't command the force of capital, were not considered to be worthy of thought. Although, certainly in the Ernst May was, of course, a very good example of something that didn't do that, and the Siedlungen, which...
I mean, we could roll through them now. I mean, would you consider JPU?
JPU.
Yeah, would he be rationalist?
Well...
Would Gropius be rationalist? Yes. Great.
The Bauhaus, without question, but because the Bauhaus... more than any building, I think, of that period, makes clear what the internal plan is with respect to the external form of the building and to its section, in a way that no building these days has any idea of how to achieve that.
We could use the example as if you happen to check into a Premier Inn tonight, you will be occupying a building which was never intended to be a hotel. Yeah. Where basically they've strung out a bunch of rooms across a floor plate which was for something else. So you could make sure when you go up to your room and you find that there's half a window, you go back down to the reception and try and get a better room. That's always my advice with Premier Inn. But the thing is, whilst the Bauhaus is a great building, and it was shocking the way the postmodernists dissed it. But why did they diss it? Because crikey, it was in the East. In the late 1960s and 70s, of course. They hadn't done anything with it. And Dessau was the last place the Germans held before the Red Army came to Berlin. So, of course, that building was in an absolute terrible state. And so Charles Jenks and Co. could use it as to say how awful the modernist aesthetics were. And then, of course, everybody thinks that Walter Gropius wasn't a very good architect, but look at those masters' houses at the Bauhaus. They're terrific.
Yeah.
Really, really terrific. And his own house in New Haven is terrific too, apparently. But, I haven't seen it. No, but, this is a fundamental mistake, isn't it? Postmodernism, of course, can offer up spaces, the relationships of buildings, urban possibilities, which we can now take as marvellous, although it didn't. And just as well as for me,
modernism could,
seems to be that
which it did.
Everybody walking around in a sort of blue mist, reflecting and contemplating on their own practice, which seems to be actually not intelligent at all.
But Paul, they're bound to be because they are commodity architects. If you design a building like a Nike sneaker, then you have a saleable commodity. I mean, this is architecture of the cake tray par excellence, which contemplates no neighbours at all, has to dominate, is profoundly retinal.
It's conducive to, really. It's conducive to the whole late capitalist, blimmin' ridiculous farce.
Well, it's not. It doesn't reflect late capitalism. It is.
It is.
That's its wellspring.
That's it.
Yes.
I mean, funnily enough, right at this moment, my wife is going to a meeting, one of the thousands of meetings we've gone to with the council, which is absolutely useless, about the refurbishment of our council block, of course, with 64 flats on a Le Corbusier model built in 1959. The council cannot possibly see itself as refurbishing this block in any reasonable way, whilst it works extremely well with a variety of old people, young people, smack addicts, professors, whatever, it doesn't really matter. It's perfect housing. And what do? The typical version of events now is after all of these meetings, when one has been completely ineffectual, they will announce yet another fun day with balloons for consultation purposes. And it is the most tragic, exemplar of a failure to grasp the real issue. Just do it up properly and it'll last for another 40 years.
Yes, quite. But of course these decisions are drawn up against the existing budgets. So, this determination is already hung up by the neck. And because you can only operate within the parameters that have been set by some other community somewhere by money. Well, quite. And by short-term money. It's not that... It isn't even sensible money. A money that might say, well, this is 40 years of not having to invest in this thing again, and by which time the value of this property, it doubles every 10 years or something. So, if the property is worth $250,000 now, in 40 years it will be worth not just 4 times, but it'll have doubled 4 times. So that'll be 50, 100, 200, 400,000.
Well, no wonder everybody says don't sell it.
Well,
right.
Don't sell it, quite. What personally concerns me is that an interest in certain substantial intellectual points of departure gets reduced into a style. Right? And, oh, look, this is the way I form my architecture on these intellectual principles. Now it becomes a commodity for everybody else to enter into and everybody else to copy, and then there's a tendency, and then there's a style, and then there's a, oh my God, isn't this the best stuff? And doesn't it represent precisely the bourgeois values he wants to undermine?
Yeah.
Which is, I'm much more interested in the operating values, the foundational values of this engagement. And they were a giving up of a debt to the mythology of archaeology and ancient architecture, and the establishment of an engagement with spatial and functional requirements.
The spiritual roof light.
Well, it's not new. I would think that they would distance themselves. Yeah, exactly. They want to get rid of this kind of mythological basis to an architecture, and to only engage it with respect to a strict mental and intellectual series of processes.
Yeah.
In other words, you can ask yourself serious questions about the nature of architecture. Can it be light? Can it be... I can't see why Buckminster Fuller wouldn't be included in this kind of rational tendency, because he asked this question: how heavy is your building? That the building might be light, it might be thin.
So let's take an example of what I would say was not very... When people started saying that architecture should be more playful, was it just a reaction against the so-called tawdriness of modern architecture, which really wasn't tawdry at all?
Well, I'm presuming you're referring to the SI and its ludic tendencies.
Well, maybe. I was actually thinking of Michael Graves.
I see. Yeah. Well, this is what I think.
Yeah, go on.
Then the SI emerge with a philosophy of homo ludens, right? We're not working for the corporate capitalist anymore. We are going to create a series of experiences, of situations which are beyond work. We don't need to work. Humans have solved this problem, as they could state in the 60s, after Marcuse had written One-Dimensional Man, because he opens with a statement that the United States and the Soviet Union at that time grew more grain than the whole of the world's population could consume in 1962. So the Situationists International were well aware of this kind of thing, understanding that homo ludens was a serious possibility. And beyond that, of course, homo ludens would necessarily have to deterritorialise the nature of political geography. In other words, the distribution of political power across the world in terms of geographical divisionism. Hence their psychogeography, which is a tendency.
Now psychogeography has become some dreadful thing.
No, but to get back to
Ian Sinclair, or Will Self walking to Heathrow. It's become a travesty of that.
I know.
It's become an absolute travesty.
But what I want to point out is that this idea of the playing human being playful has emerged in architecture in the 50s as a political attack on capitalism.
Right.
It then gets represented in architecture through the tittle-tattle of Michael Graves and Robert Stern, who wants to make capital buildings for Walt Disney, with its capitals turned into gnomes and God knows what else.
Swans, dolphins.
Which is a complete travesty of the original idea. It can't distance itself from this idea because it's part and parcel of a serious architectural history.
Not only do we have to worry about words like using the word rational, because each one we can bring our own terms to it, we should also be very careful about using the word playful.
Well, look, rationalism can be understood as a style.
Yeah.
You know, the Italian Rationalist, the Tendenza, Gruppo 7.
By that we're meaning
a
Giuseppe
certain
Tirani.
kind of Giuseppe Tirani,
Libera.
Grazzi, Libera, what's his name?
Well, you've got it in your book. I mean, that's something I'd like to
Moretti.
move on to talk about, I think, because there's something we've always, architects, in my experience, and it's getting to be a relatively long experience now, and for both of us, they always tend to like buildings by Giuseppe Tirani and Libera and all the rest of it. They tend to really, really like them. And of course, that gets all rather awkward when they were built for Mussolini and so on. Is it the fact that the rationalist style managed to obviate some sort of overt connection, which of course is made between Albert Speer and Adolf Hitler in their sort of symbiotic relationship?
Have you got any problems with the whole host of popes who employed the likes of Borromini and Bramante,
of course, no,
who
I
had
don't.
rather suspicious political backgrounds, and weren't averse to the odd murder and so on and so forth, and who were politically forceful, let's say, in the way that they organised the power of the papal state. And no, of course, it's an order of magnitude to compare them with other people, but I mean, architecture, unfortunately, is associated with highly distasteful political tendencies, but it remains architecture, and it is a signifier. It is not a thing in itself.
So that view would allow Leon Krier to write about Albert Speer as a great architect. Well, personally, I don't share that view. I can't. I just can't bring myself to. I remember most architects I know get into terrible difficulty. They start to squirm if you talk about, Nazi architecture. In particular, because of course the Auschwitz is the perfect rational vehicle. It is. It has. For instance, you don't have to pay your workers. I mean, you have the ultimate factory.
Well, it was Rossi. And Rossi, a member of the Italian Communist Party, editor of Domus in the 60s, who said there are the two major paradigms or typologies of the 20th century were the prison and the barracks.
Yeah.
And so Auschwitz, being a barracks, would be effectively a rational disposition.
That took a real piece of guts to be able to say that sort of stuff, really. I mean, the intellectual climate to be able to say that.
Well, but I think the intellectual climate in '66
you couldn't say that now. You can't even
on a point of turning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You couldn't say any of that now because people get criticised for.
Oh.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh. Think about what happened to Ken Livingstone. Yeah.
Well, quite. I mean, do you want to condemn Wagner and his oeuvre because he was bitterly anti-Semitic. So much so that he caused a schism with Nietzsche, and was bitterly anti-Semitic in public and continuously. So we don't seem to have the same problem with listening to Wagnerian operatic production as opposed to going to see the.
So there is a way in which, like when we look at when we look at Tirani's Casa del Fascio, we can appreciate it for architecture's sake, to some extent.
Well, certainly that's the way I look at it.
Yeah.
I mean, I look at the tendencies, the rational tendencies in the work, and how it wrapped up, and very powerfully, and to a much higher level, and you're going to choke on this, the tendency that Corbusier attempted to sketch out. I mean, for me, this is the paradigm of, and the highest watermark of modernist production, the Casa del Fascio.
Really?
Yeah.
My God.
Well, I was educated in the United States, and of course, and I was educated by Colin Rowe, and that was Peter Eisenman's favourite building, and so I was saturated in that association with the burgeoning postmodernist position in the United States and the relationship it had to Italian Quattrocento, Cinquecento, and later
so
developments.
you would see Giovanni as working in a modern tradition within a tradition which will go back to the Renaissance.
Well, Colin Rowe did.
Yeah.
And he saw Corbusier in the same way. So Turani was, associated with that tendency without question.
So why? I mean, for me, there's only a portion of Le Corbusier which would be considered anything to do with rationality. It's probably shown best in the Pavilion Suisse, where you obviously, if you're faced with the problem of housing students, you give them all the same accommodation, apart from the masters who get something slightly different on the roof. This would be a definition for me of rationalism. If your legal system says that you put somebody away for 6 months in jail, then the cells should all be the same. That would be a rational position. And Le Corbusier was very good at that. But of course you have moral, empirical and artistic considerations that Le Corbusier always throws into the mix, and which are less evident, I think, perhaps with Turani, although it's hard to say. So Le Corbusier is so obviously poetic at certain moments in the Pavilion Suisse when he does that funny wall, and when you
but
put
we have to be very careful not to allow our understanding of rationalism to become the one we've received as an interpretation of the Bauhaus, right? That it was that it pioneered form as a secondary idea to utility.
Right.
So utility establishes the plan and form follows that condition. It seems to me that the Italian, certainly the Italian tendenza, which was the period in the 60s, was interested in returning to a kind of, let's call it a functional aesthetic, but to stitch into that an interest in maintaining the city as a continuous monument. So there was a notion, and this you can see this writ large in the Casa del Faccio, and this is why I think that it's a superior building to anything that Corbusier did, and why it's associated with what Ungers did, is that there is, behind the facade, a cortile. And the cortile is an extension of the city street immediately in front of the building. Now that relationship you never, ever, ever get in the West. The West is completely opaque to these kinds of ideas. However, that became a secure association with what became neo-rationalism in the 80s and postmodern neo-rationalism. And certainly for Ungers, where the object...
That's when everybody started drawing their figure ground plans,
that's when they
to show their cortile in the middle of their buildings with an obsession.
Now, for me,
ridiculous.
There is an association with Mies, because Mies, even though his geometry is much stricter, wants to pull the skirts up of all his buildings to reveal transparent panties, if I can say that.
Oh, yes,
in other words, the ground story is transparent, and so there is a free space.
The Crone column.
The Crone column. There is a
it's
free
not there.
space.
Conceptually, it's not there.
Exactly, conceptually it's not there. But there is a free space on the stylobate of the city, on the street level, which is continuous through these large monoliths that are above the city, and you wander freely through all these spaces.
Don't worry.
But
at the same time, that when I'm thinking about Mies and I'm thinking about the disappearing column, I have to think about the Tugendhat house, which of course underwent an inquisition under the Soviet regime, who said it was by definition uninhabitable. Because it represented thoroughly bourgeois values. And I think it does. Which is why they turned it into a gymnasium for thoroughly good use for that building.
It's kind of ironic when you look at the refurbished buildings in St. Petersburg, isn't it?
Oh, God. Good God. Well,
dripping with gold leaf and vast spaces. Reflecting the hall of mirrors at Versailles.
Catherine the Great's extraordinary appetite for goo.
And for horses, so they tell me.
And horses. I mean, they are extraordinary, although she did employ Charles Cameron, who was a very restrained neoclassical architect. But of course, you know why he went there. Because this is why architecture is such a fabulous subject. Is because that he had locked up his own dad in debtor's prison here in London for disposing of some busts and some books. because he had no money. And so therefore Charles Cameron was dissuaded from, it was outlawed from London society. So he was like going to Dubai or wherever it was, the equivalent, to go to St. Petersburg. He'd fraudulently written a book on the Roman baths, which he ripped off somebody else. And
really?
He went to found himself in St. Petersburg, just like one might find oneself in Dubai today, or Uzbekistan.
I did once find myself in Dubai.
God, it's bloody awful.
Yeah, it's the worst place on the face of the earth.
It's just about the worst place. I can't imagine any Dubai. I mean, my favourite building by Mies van der Rohe is actually the new National Gallery, Berlin, which I consider to be the 20th century's horizontal cathedral.
Well, let's talk about this, because across the road is the Staatsbibliothek by Schinkel. Not by Schinkel, by Sharoon. So here we have the two tendencies of the 20th century. On the one side, a neoclassicism which nobody dare touch, and on the other, so the odd thing was that we have these polarities which have never really been satisfactorily understood. You know, one is a rational tendency which begins to signify, in a modernist idiom, a return to neoclassicism. The other is a romantic, dynamic equilibrium.
Well, it's now called the other tradition, and it's almost all pervasive. A book like Colin St. John Wilson's The Other Tradition would once be, it's still a very marginal book, and it's so expensive and very few students would have read it. But it is now, in terms of the intellectual currency of the architectural world, it's almost everywhere. So when we're thinking about Peter Blundell-Jones writing about Haring's, cowshed, he never says, well, this is an absolutely splendid and peculiar example of sexual hierarchy that you can possibly imagine. The idea that the bull has the lady cows have to see the bull cow all the time. Well, how do we translate that into work for humans? But it's gone completely accepted that this other tradition, which now includes Alto, God help us, is more important than the rationalist tradition, which is probably why we're sitting here trying to talk about it, because there are plenty of us, I think, who aspire to that classical tradition to some extent, whilst not aspiring to necessarily Dimitri or Leon Krier. And you see it all the way through any book on Ungers. You see classical planning all the way through.
Well, classical planning with an association with a kind of, it's infected by the rotated square, which he took from Malevich.
Right.
And so there is some suprematist infection in the organisation of work. I mean, we were constantly looking at projects which had to do several things at the same time, because he was interested in Nicholas of Cusa, Nicholas of Cusa, who established the doctrine of a coincidenza oppositorum, coincidence of opposites, effectively a dialectic condition, in which the building within the urban grain would respond to the forces that were present upon it. And so he had a number of problems. One was how to centralise the internal courtyard, which often was a square. And so he would rotate the building which subtended that square in another building which surrounded it, which then addressed the urban conditions which were immediately present on the site. So you had the presence of two opposite tendencies resolved in the architecture.
Right.
Again,
I'm sure if we went through the book, which we can't do on this device, but we could find numerous examples.
Numerous, yeah. That was his main tendency. He extracted this from Weinbrenner, and Weinbrenner, of course, is much more orthogonal in the way that he achieved this, whereas Ungers allowed the geometry to twist.
I mean, there is that, because now we could jump ship entirely and sort of go to California and go, okay, here we are sitting here in London, rather fond of European architecture, rather fond of the Tendenza, rather fond of Ungers, and think, oh my God, if I go to Malibu and I think of some of the projects that Frank Gehry did when he was starting out, what kind of operation is going on there which might be reflected in any kind of rationality? Or was he just having fun?
Well, whatever he was doing, he wasn't being rational.
Well, there is a thing, though, that he was a very commercial architect when he started out. And he worked for extreme. I mean, he
Well,
decided to jump off the cliff in a commercial practice because the client said to him, "If you're really interested in what you've just done to your house, what the hell are you doing this commercial crap for me for?" And so Gary sort of jumped off the cliff and became the superstar with his fish or whatever it is, and with the Guggenheim Bilbao and so on. Where there are some early houses which are they're terrific reworkings of sort of modern art principles. Mm-hmm. Shifting the grid, doing... there's one which has got the plan almost like a Mondrian, where Mondrian turned the picture plane at 45 degrees after 20 years. Which I think is a brilliant move. And he does a house, on that principle.
Well, the reason Mondrian did that, you know this.
No, I can't.
And like so many other neoplasticists at the time, Malevich, Theodor van Beersberg, very spiritually
weird.
Engaged. Well, we call it weird, maybe not weird, but what Mondrian attempted to do, certainly in the exhibition in New York at the Whitney in the 20s, was to attempt to dematerialise the frame. He wanted no frame, because to Mondrian, the lines on the paper weren't lines, of course. They were tendencies or lines of force which circled the globe. They took off from one side of the canvas.
So that sounds like Mr. Fuller.
As if he pushed the canvas.
That's what Buckminster Fuller said when his school teacher said, where does this line go? And she said it goes to infinity. And he said, no, it doesn't. It goes round the back of the blackboard and joins up with the other end of your line, which I thought was very funny. But anyway, all I know is that I know Mondrian didn't like green because he didn't like nature.
He didn't like nature. Didn't like trees in the city. Think that all should be got rid of. But then, that's merely a moment in a kind of intellectual engagement with a tendency of thinking about art in a certain way. I mean, if we laugh at all this stuff, we lose what its intention was. And I mean, there's lots of laughter at the moment as we slide down that slippery slope of the end of all times, which we are absolutely
there is
nearing the end of.
Yes, that's true. If you don't laugh, you cry. Yeah, I guess we're all guilty of that to some extent. The last days of Rome, sort of, that's the feeling, perhaps.
Well, there is... The way I present it to myself is the lack of the project. There is no project. There is no God. There is no queen. There is no state. There is no project. The project, what would the project be? The project would be to build the holy city, build the golden city, build a city worthy of its name. Not a utopia.
Because you can't.
Look, Imperial Rome and the Greek Acropolis built a city in the Bronze Age. We can't even do that now. And we think that we're so advanced. We're not advanced at all. And currently, when I'm working commercially, the plan doesn't matter. The plan and the structure are not associated. We just design the plans and put the structure on later by negotiation with the structural engineer. Why? Because it's quicker.
Well, that really does mean that all of this is gone.
It's
in
gone.
The commercial world. That's it. Finito.
It has. I mean, look, where's it gone? I mean, the thing is that the commercial calculations, which any dummy can do, are about gross over net calculations, gross space and net space. Net space being that space which is rentable, and the different kinds of net space for commercial housing, commercial office. Certain things can be added, certain things can't be added. For instance, in commercial office space, if the columns stand inside the commercial office space, they're part of the rent. If they're outside, they're not part of the rent. In which case, if you put them outside, it will cost you more to build the building than if you put them inside. And tremendous things like this, which are structurally influential on the nature of the architecture. So we're paying through the nose for marginal additions to profit that commercial developers
and that
are
wouldn't
pursuing.
be considered rational. because the system doesn't work.
Well, don't forget, rationalism is not what we think. It's not empiricism, okay?
Yeah.
It's not reduction to the
And
lowest
it's not
common
your bank
denominator
balance.
at all. No.
It's not pounds per square foot.
It is the means by which we understand the world intellectually by getting rid of myth. And that does not exclude everything other than the bank balance. That is not rational. I mean, rationalism, of course, is a process of thinking. But the tendency of which have been called rationalist, include many other things, including, for instance, and you can't really escape this. If you're going to think rationally about the structure, you could also think rationally about the city, about the external space, about the relationship building to building, about solid to void, about containing public space within the body of the building, and all these kind of things which we don't think about anymore. All of that was part of the rationalist agenda. I mean, it became distilled in a style. That's the problem. Like everything, this is Adorno. This is hypostatization.
And the worst example of that style you would probably put as being, I don't know, Paternoster Square.
Which the refurbishment or the previous?
No, the one the latest version is a sort of cliche pop puree of half digested urban.
Well, not for me, because rationalism
it
has to go right through
Right.
the project, like always. So you get, certainly in the earlier work, there was a reduced aesthetic which suited itself only to the demands of the utility of the building, right? And then there were responses to the demands of the urban context and the demands of public space with respect to the
there's a good deal of
mass
this,
the
which,
building.
as far as you're concerned, is to do with stringency, being stringent about.
Yes, it's an intellectual.
tough.
It's an intellect. It's why I think it's close to, the conceptualism of Sol LeWitt. Right, you come up with an idea and you pursue it. Without.
Well, this is, of course, why you wouldn't like Le Corbusier as much as Turaghi. I mean, it's
No,
obvious.
No, not at all. I mean, look, I see it as an intellectual tendency.
Yeah.
I mean, I support it and I'm fascinated by it and I admire its intellectual stringency. But I'm not opposed to the work of Corbusier.
No.
At all. And I'm not opposed to the work of somebody like...
or Alto, or anybody.
Huh?
I mean, Alto is a very good
not
example.
Alto, no, not at all. Even though
Because
I
it's
think
terrific, but,
it's terrific, exactly. And I mean, I'm more interested in saying, wow, this is an experience, how do I understand it? And, I'm absolutely happy to engage in an understanding of rationalism, try to understand it in terms of what it's trying to
Okay, so if
achieve.
we boil it down a little bit, it's less of the current tendency, which is I feel, therefore I am. Mm-hmm. But to actually, for you, the basis is to really think it through and to find the satisfaction in those rationalist principles. Because, of course, these days, the feeling bit has taken over massively.
Well, you say that. I'm not so sure. I mean,
okay.
I just think it's a kind of new Victorianism, that it's all aspidistra and funny curtains, and actually, the rest is smoke and mirrors. There is no... I mean, what we build in this city are yards and yards of exsanguinated white interiors, lashed up with bits of crappy marble and some kit from the IKEA catalogue. It is just bad. It's
No other way of putting it.
It looks like it's fresh, It was the sort of interior you see on lots of trendy TV shows where there is a sort of an island kitchen unit.
So it must drive you mad when you look at something like Grand Designs, which I can't imagine you actually look at, and they're talking about what a lovely space everything is.
Yeah,
drives me absolutely bizarre. It's like the same as Gardener's World for me. It drives me mad when I go, it's a lovely flower bed. Because I go, why? How? How is it a lovely flower bed?
Yes,
it's a plant doesn't know how it's beautiful. Therefore, we are looking at an operation. We are looking at a particular procedure which has made this flower bed lovely.
Exactly.
And that's Lefebvre, of course. It's easy. You only have to read The Production of Space to get that. But it is extraordinary how many people will suck up this, it's a lovely little shed, or it's a lovely little, grand design, or it's a lovely flower bed. And everything has to be lovely and everybody has to be polite, and there's no rigour to it at all.
Well, quite. I mean, there's no criticism, or no, that's the wrong word, analysis of what these terms actually point at, or where they're derived from. And there may be diminutive forms of other kinds of concepts which are not engaged in, like the miniature, for instance, which was written on by Levi-Strauss, comes back in notions like small is beautiful, as if the size of the object, which may be exquisite in itself, also offers itself up as a condition of scale. And when you have an exquisitely painted miniature of a beautiful woman, you can't really understand it in any other way than with respect to its relationship to you as a physical body. That's got to be present. In other words, you dominate it. It doesn't dominate you. That narrative is not included.
So that's why we have programs about special sheds.
They're little sheds.
Because we ain't got anywhere to live.
Yes, but we don't. The hidden stories of the little shed are never told. Like, it's a masturbatory heaven for the old guy, and we don't have that. And it goes, that's always in the background. And Christ, why would a person of good taste even think of that? Well, because unfortunately it's part of the human state, and if you want to obscure it, that one begins to think there's some problem with the way we understand things. So the shed, great sheds of the United Kingdom, it seems to me like the last bastion, the last shudder of the decadence of architectural vacuity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think
but the shed is almost equivalent to that, or the this kind of embrace of naturalism which you see in architectural schools. That some CGI producing program can give you
biomimicry.
Why would you want to mimic? Why would you want to do this? The Egyptians made, they made a building. And
It need biomimicry. I mean, it does. The more you talk, the more absurd it becomes. This must be very frustrating for you.
It's ridiculous.
Because the discourse has disappeared to some extent. I mean, and you have to be at it for a while to understand it. It's easy for somebody to come along and say they're interested in biomimicry if they're having an interview for a PhD at the Bartlett. And so on. I interviewed a student recently who was just completing their PhD on clothing as city, and she built a shed in Greece, but she built it out of steel. And I went, well, why the hell would you build a shed in Greece out of steel where it's really hot? It's like, what on earth has that got to do with clothing and the city?
Yes, really.
It's just like there's so many disjunctions and there's so many really, really weird things going on, all in the name of fueling various forms of capitalistic practice. There are 60 PhD students at the Bartlett. 60!
What did they do? Mouse grooming?
And there is somebody to blame for how this has happened.
Well, it is a product, I think, of the necessity of tertiary education institutions to make money. And what are they offering these things for? And what does it produce? I've never read a PhD thesis in my entire life which was pertinent to the way I make commercial architecture. Nothing. Never. No. Not one.
They are the wickedest example of being irrelevant.
I mean, the things that were influential weren't written by PhD students, were they? They were written by Venturi, Corbusier. These weren't PhD students. Turani, Rossi, people who had a very different engagement with architecture.
Yeah.
Almost, and so on.
Yeah.
The architectural historians, for me, certainly the ones who weren't prepared to engage with historiography as an intellectual pursuit, which is most of them, just storytellers, of course, are not. What's extraordinary is about your book was that it was such a breath of fresh air in terms of reading a history, because most histories are so formulaic, they repeat the same things from a slightly different perspective. I don't quite know what their unique selling point is, other than the stuff updated.
Well, I mean, you could say that about a lot of work that's produced these days. That usually you can condense it to 2 sentences. But there you go. But people spend an awful amount of effort and money.
Well, there's much to do. That's the problem. I mean, surely there's a huge amount to do in terms of what we might consider to be commodious in contemporary architecture. I mean, take office, for instance. These sort of serried ranks of desks with the same... I mean, computing makes this almost inevitable. They're ranked in the most hideous way. You know, at one time, people wanted chill-out spaces because they were afraid that they simply couldn't recruit, but that's all gone. You know, there is no, secondary withdrawal space. You know, it's a kind of
Not
idea.
even a ping-pong table these days.
No. It's maximum return. Maximum return is the only... It's just that as it was when I was in Houston in the early 80s. Maximum net return over gross building volume, and which 80%, 82%, and that's what we work to. So we're making housing with the smallest internal corridor possible in order to maximise the return. And unlit, no natural daylight in the internal. I mean, this has been going on. Daubon and Dart were doing this, in the late 70s. I've been to a project by them, which was awarded an RIBA gold medal, not a gold medal, an RIBA award, but it has internal corridors which have no external natural light, just a tiny little corridor which feeds off to a number of buildings, rooms which do have natural light, but the internal corridor doesn't.
No.
I mean, some people say, who cares, you can switch the light on, which is the kind of state that architecture's in.
Not for much longer, mate. No.
Well, whether we'll have any architecture at all. I mean, maybe there are some people who want to embrace the fact that architecture as a creative art will become entirely virtual. And
the point of our discussion, in a way, is to revisit this notion of the rational, because the sense is that it's gone. And that we have the professional, and we have empathy, we have feeling for spaces, like interior designers might have. But they just might, but we don't have, and we have endless amounts of style you can pick off the internet, and you have pick and mix and all the rest of it. You can populate a room any way you like, and a lot of clients now call the shots when it comes to the architect. They say, I want this. And if you can't deliver it, then that's no good. It means the architect of your persuasion, or my persuasion, in my more disciplined moments, is terribly disappointed because they can't in any way find any intellectual succour to the thing.
That's right. Precisely right, yeah. I mean, clients come, even commercial clients come now, assuming that they're purchasing a commodity. And it's a profound.
And this is mirrored, of course, in building, where the builders also have to approach it in exactly the same way. So there's no aspect of the craft that you might have wanted.
Craft is completely... I mean, it's disintegrated so quickly that even my... tenuous grip on the technical side of architectural practice seems now to be encyclopedic compared to everybody I work with, which is maybe just a matter of getting older, but it is a bit shocking. Nobody seems to know what an invert level is, or how to switch on a tap, or why use an anti-siphonage trap, anything like that. What are three-phase suppliers and a one-phase supplier? Things that are kind of basic, nobody knows anything about. And one wonders how the hell... I'm talking about contractors, mate, not about architects. And it's... Yes, I mean, the idea that there are those people who can resist the idea that the profession has been dumbed down is ridiculous. The profession is almost... catatonic, I would say.
Meanwhile, of course, with the rise of the Heideggerians, a passion for your feeling about the world seems to be omnipresent. I find this extraordinarily difficult to understand. Well, not understand. I think it's precisely because the world is disappearing before your eyes that you therefore get an elevated sense of yourself, especially in an identity politics orientated world. Because the notion of a consensus or the notion of a solidarity has disappeared.
Completely.
And this is clearly the way of disaster. So this is why we talk about the end of times, because if a society is not working in some kind of concert, then you're pretty lost.
quite so. I mean, we talk about it as if it's always across the road, just about to happen. It's actually happened some time ago, and we're not approaching hell; we're in it. And I don't think this hell will be quite the cataclysmic sort of explosion that everybody seems to think it will be. I think it's a slow death that is already entrenched. I mean.
That's what Zizek says. He says it will be a long time dark. He says keep out of the way.
It's going to be a long time dark. It's very dark, and people are now so inured to it they can't even see it anymore. The idea that machines can think for humans is so ludicrously funny that any moron who thinks this, is totally entrapped in this kind of ideological false consciousness. That the slightest dialectical shift in human creativity could not outwit a computer in milliseconds is self-evident. Yeah. The problem isn't that. The problem is that the powers that be realise that human action and human interaction, social interaction, needs to be homogenised with respect to machine activity. Not the other way around. Machines can't interpret what humans do because they could be entirely so unpredictable at will. No, machines need you to be entirely predictable. So the state performs that role, and it's performed that role in architecture. It's reduced it to the capital nexus, that everything is reduced to a calculating profit and loss spreadsheet. Everything's associated with those measurements, and everything's incorporated in those measurements. All you need is that in order to make your developer a profit, he has to engage in a competitive commercial market, and you have to deliver at lowest cost. So you will be inevitably entrenched into a complete formulaic structure, that's why that all the architecture in London looks the same.
And it will get worse as profits get lower, as Marx predicted. Yeah. Of course, as profitability declines,
exactly.
Then you're going to get more and more formulaic stuff. So we're actually in a version of the Soviet Union in around about 1973.
Worse. Worse. The Soviet Union can recover. We can't. I mean, and don't forget, the Russians say that we are the great on free. And we think this is funny. Yeah. They say we're intellectually unfree. And this is an irony, of course, because we've been told for decades that, of course, they're the people in prison, and then we are the free. At least you can afford that irony of seeing that when you watch RT, Russia Today, you see the other side of the coin, and the other side of the news. I'm not suggesting you believe the BBC or RT, but you want to experience the tension between these two polarities. At least they can say, well, you don't look free to us from our perspective, which gives us pause to think about precisely what is happening to us, which we're not. And in architecture, we're not at all. And the vanguard schools of reflection, which should be so critical, are anything but. They've collapsed into their own commodity masturbation.
True. The symptoms of ambition, rampant ambition and personal gain, have, of course, removed... I mean, I can see this even from the time when I was educated in Bristol and then moved to London. Of course, it's inevitable that there are shifts and they happen all the way through. And sometimes you can't fight the whole world. I mean, it's rolling on a certain programme. But it's meant some really, really bad architecture is praised to the... I mean, I heard somebody the other day in an interview, which I had the misfortune to be part of the panel on, describing his architecture as being responsive to the weather, as if it was extraordinarily important. And, our architecture has been responsive to the weather, since time immemorial. The idea that this could become some extraordinary intellectual feat was balmy. But this guy had 2 books about how his architecture is responsive to the weather.
Right.
And you kind of go...
It's
just kind of, what's going on?
Well, I suppose when the vessel is empty, what are you going to turn to? I don't know. I mean, I just know.
So those clever architects, the rationalist architects, you can say, although I think that Peter Eisenman's Jewish Memorial in Berlin is very good. personally, because of three reasons. Number one, he says you can do anything you like on it, but not that it's down to him, but that was the preset. Mm-hmm. And number two, it had no memorial for the Jews who were executed. And number three, no explanation. Mm-hmm. And number three, it looks good from any camera angle. So it's impossible to take a bad photograph of it. And this, I thought, was very perceptive of Peter Eisenman in an age of selfies and all the rest of it. That he understood that maybe if people took a photograph of it, they might go back to their computer and look up the Holocaust themselves. Mm-hmm. But a lot of Peter Eisenman's architecture, which takes obviously Tirani being, somebody who was very much, somebody he loved, looks absolutely terrible in my opinion. But then again, so does most of American architecture. He says grimacing rather.
Yeah, well, most of it.
Because it can't be anything else.
Well, this opens up a whole new horizon, right? I mean, as to what we think of as architecture. Certainly, when we discuss it, we talk about less than 1%. In fact, probably less than 1/100th of 1% of the buildings that are made in the world. Not that less than 1/100th of 1% are made by architects. Much more is, but much of it is of no consequence whatsoever and not worth a second look.
Yeah.
So we're talking about a very, very small aspect of the world. And if you want to understand architecture with respect to its context, that is, the cities in which it's set, or not, if it's agrarian architecture, if you want to talk about its context, then everything else that's built is certainly of significance in some way or another. But it is not written about. It's certainly theorised about only infrequently. There are only periods in which this emerges. Quartermain de Quincy has virtually been completely forgotten. The idea of a typology which might inform certain kind of strategies for architecture has disappeared. I don't know anyone who knows this. I've never spoken about that in a commercial office in 40 years. The only time I spoke about it was when I was with Unges. So, what does this mean? There is a comprehensive eradication of understanding in architecture, a purposeful eradication of understanding in architecture, because there's a determination to reduce it to its unit cost, its lowest unit cost. Everything soon will be Sweden, and we will detest it as the Danes detest the Swedes.
Right, that will do, I think, because that is correct.